Hello and welcome to the lecture for topic 4. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about women and the right to vote. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to talk about the importance of political rights to a democratic government. Next, we're going to be talking about voting rights in the United States Constitution. And then we're going to look at the two reasons that were given to argue for why women should be given the right to vote. Or as it says there, competing reasons for women's suffrage. And when you see that word suffrage, it doesn't mean like suffering, but suffrage is a word for the right to vote. And so that's why people who fight for the right to vote are known as suffragettes. Now, make sure to watch the other two videos that I've posted for this week. There's one lecture and there's two other short videos from public television stations. And they're really, really interesting. One is digs in to look at the divisions that took place at the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's convention in the United States. And it was dedicated in large part to expanding the rights for women, including the right to vote. And then also there's a 10-minute video called The Untold Stories of Black Women in the Suffrage Movement. So make sure that you look at all three of the videos because there will be quiz questions on the lecture quiz that take all three of the videos into consideration. So let's go ahead and get started. So as it says at the top there, that universal political rights are the cornerstone of a democracy. So for a country to be considered a democracy, democracies rest on this principle of popular sovereignty. And what that means is that the political authority rests ultimately in the hands of the people. Political authority doesn't rest in the hands of a king or a queen or a group of few aristocrats. But in a democracy, the ultimate decisions are made by the people. That doesn't mean we have a direct democracy. It mostly means that we have opportunities, meaningful opportunities to participate in the political process. Okay. And so, for a country to be considered fully democratic and truly free, the political rights must be inclusive, okay? In other words, all adult citizens have to be able to partake of political rights, such as the right to vote, the right to hold a political office, the right to serve on a jury, which is really important in terms of the administration of justice. And so that if countries exclude people from voting, holding political office, or serving on juries, it's hard to consider that country to be a democracy. And when we look at the history of the United States, for over 175 years, the United States falls well short of universal political rights. So let's take a look at the Constitution and look at how why the United States has fallen short and the pathway that they took to expand universal political rights. So when you look at the Constitution of the United States, prior to the addition of amendments that we're gonna talk about in a little bit, there's nothing in the Constitution that identifies or provides criteria or a guidance in terms of who has the right to vote. As it says there, the Constitution does not identify who has the right to vote. And as you'll see in the first video that you're going to watch this week, that they didn't want to answer that question at the Constitutional Convention. It was way too controversial. And in fact, there was sort of an implicit understanding that who had the right to vote was white property-owning men, but they didn't want to be indelicate and actually state the truth. So they punted, as they say in the video, and they left the decisions to the states. So it was up to the states to determine who was qualified to vote and what those qualifications were. And in fact, when the Supreme Court of the United States was asked the question, do you have a constitutional right to vote? They concluded that being a citizen does not mean that you have a constitutional right to vote. And we know this because of the case we discussed last week, Minor versus Happerstam. When Virginia Minor went in Missouri, she tried to vote and she was denied and she took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, nope, you don't have a constitutional right to vote. So just because you don't have a constitutional right to vote doesn't mean that you can't vote. It just depends on the state that you live in. And so similar to abortion rights today, people in the United States can still get legal abortions. It depends on the state that you live in. And the same was true with voting. Some states extended the vote to free slaves. So Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York allowed free slaves to vote there. And some states, particularly Western states, extended the right to vote to women, particularly because there weren't a lot of women on the Western frontier. And so extending suffrage rights to women was a way to sort of encourage them to come and move out west. But if it's not a constitutional right, that right can be taken away. And so when it comes to achieving universal suffrage, you need to amend the Constitution. And that's what happened. So following the Civil War, the 15th Amendment is added to the Constitution. That basically says you can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We know that that's controversial, particularly among the women who are fighting for women's right to vote. So some white women were not wanting to support the 15th Amendment because they felt that white women should get the right to vote before black men. And it takes another, 50 so years to extend the right to vote to women with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so that, basically says you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of sex. And then that expansion continues in the 26th Amendment in 1971 that basically says that you cannot deny vote to those who are 18 years old or older. You'll notice that date because it's around the Vietnam War, and so that some states you had to be 21 to vote, and that you couldn't vote, but you were getting drafted to go fight in a war. And so we see that those changes there. So these are the big amendments that expand suffrage, the right to vote in the United States. Obviously, this week you're going to be learning about the 19th Amendment. But I just wanted to say we still have a lot of work to do before we achieve universal suffrage. For one, some states don't allow felons to vote, even if they are done with their sentence and aren't under the supervision of the state. So about 16 million or 6 million people in the United States suffer from what's known as felony disenfranchisement. So once you commit a felony, you can never vote in that state again. And also we have work to do in terms of ballot access and making the ballot more accessible and not having barriers to voting. But this gives you a nice overview of the expansion of universal suffrage in the United States. So the struggle for women's suffrage was a long struggle, and it was a diverse struggle as well. And one thing to keep in mind is that the struggle for expanding the rights of women were really rooted in the founding principles, that the so-called American Creed that's outlined in some of our founding documents, in particular the Declaration of Independence. And so, in the Declaration of Independence, it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator by certain unalienable rights. And so, I teach American government, and we just got out of a debate where it's like, should the founders be celebrated, right? That you have an individual like Thomas Jefferson who writes these words in the Declaration of Independence, but this is a man who was a slaver and owned hundreds of slaves and didn't even let them go upon his death. And so, there's disagreements about whether or not, like, how do you make sense of that sort of hypocrisy. But the bottom line is once you, maybe not the bottom line, but one line is once you write those words down, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? So once you say that all men are created equal, well, when our rights are being taken away, you say, well, wait a second. Our founding principles is that about equality and universal rights. And so that if we're truly going to live up to the American Creed, we really have to make good on those promises. And so as you'll learn in the video, the first women's rights conference in the United States was the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, so really quite early. And as you'll read, that they presented the Declaration of Sentiments, which is basically making an argument for why women, should be granted rights, and it's modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and so it's rooted in the founding principles. The struggle for women's suffrage also has very strong ties to the abolition movement in the United States, which you'll learn about in the other videos. That women were on the front line fighting for the end of slavery, and that they used that political energy to then also say, you know what? Slavery is wrong, and also denying women rights is wrong as well. And so there are strong ties to the abolition movement. I do want you to keep in mind that just as the framers of the Constitution and the founders of this country are flawed and diverse and heterogeneous to a certain degree, that same thing is true about the women and men that are fighting for and against suffrage. You're going to be reading an article this week about the fight against the right for expanding the right to vote to women. And so that they are not homogeneous group. They're a heterogeneous group. Men and women fought for the right to vote. Men and women fought against the right to vote for women. That these were people who are white and Black and rich and poor. And so you see this complexity in this group. These are also flawed people, right? Frederick Douglass was on the front lines of both the abolition movement and also expanding the right for women's suffrage. But when it came down to it, he sided with the right for men to vote rather than the right to women to vote. Susan B. Anthony, right? Basically saying, no, white women should come first, and had some racist sentiments at the time. So it doesn't diminish the work that everybody did in order to fight for the right to vote, but just keep in mind that these are complex and at times flawed individuals. There are two major arguments that were made for women's suffrage. One was known as the equality argument, and the other is the women's voting bloc argument. So let's take a look at both of these arguments. So let's look at the equality argument. And the equality argument is basically saying that the vote, getting the right to vote, is the first step towards more general equality throughout the society. And from this perspective, they say, look, women can't truly be equal if they can't vote, right? You live in a democracy. People get a say in their democracy, and if you don't have that say, then one, you're viewed as a second-class citizen and not a full participant in the political experiment, in this democratic experiment. And furthermore, not only are you sort of seen as a second-class citizen, but if you're not allowed to vote, you can't change policies that are basically taking away your equality, right? That are reducing or diminishing your equality. So from this perspective, it was that, this is about fundamental right to be treated equally. And the vote is the first step towards being treated equally and being seen as an equal player in this democracy. Another argument along these lines with the equality is that the vote is the first step, right? But then the next step is that it leads to a fuller participation, if so chosen, in politics and in government, right? And so if you have the right to vote, then you have a reason to get involved and participating in the decisions that government is making, right? If you don't have a say, you might not pay attention. You might be angry because you don't have a say, right? But you don't have the means to change, so that you can actually get your perspective, get the right to vote, so your perspective can be taken into consideration as a part of the will of the people. And that, once women demonstrate that they are just as good of voters as anybody else, or just as bad as voters as anybody else, right? Then it kind of opens the doorway for saying, look, if you can vote, then you can participate in other forms of politics that you can hold, elected office. So it's a pathway. From the equality perspective, these women were arguing that women are diverse in political perspective, just as men are, right? Men and women are equal, right? Women don't all have the same, don't have all the same support for one political party or one particular public policy. Men don't vote as a bloc. Men aren't all members of one political party. They're saying women are just as diverse as men. That if you give women the right to vote, it doesn't mean that all women are going to vote the same way, right? It's just having more voters allowed in the decision-making process. And as any democracy, that anybody who is a citizen should have that right to vote. And so they basically said that, women are equal to men, and they're equal in terms of the diversity of political perspectives that they have. Good examples of women who fall in the equality argument camp are the equity feminists of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They argued for the right to vote because they saw it as a pathway to full political equality and social equality, for that matter, as well. The other argument for women's suffrage is what was known as the women's voting bloc. This group of folks who were fighting for the right to vote basically said, look, if you give women the right to vote, we're not viewing this as a path to full participation in the political process. We're not saying like first you vote and then you run for office and then you become president of the United States, right? That's not the argument that they were making. Whether they were saying that giving the right to vote to women allows women to influence the political process, but that it's not viewed as a path to full participation. Basically, the argument here is that giving women the right to vote and that they will bring their sensibilities to policies. They will bring their special sensibilities to who gets elected to office. And because women have this sort of special capacity that men don't have. And so if only men get to vote, right? It's only like what men's qualities are that are brought into the political process. But if you give women the right to vote, then women can bring their special capacities into the political process. And they viewed this as a way of that if you let women vote, society will actually will be improved, right? And it's this idea that women have this special vote, right? That women are more compassionate than men. They're more sympathetic to those who are suffering. They're nurturing. They're child-centered. That women see society, because women are, compassionate, then they see harms that are taking place in society, and then they are demanding social reforms to address these harms. And that the goal isn't for women to run for office, but rather women will bring their special vote to bear through their participation, and they will elect men that are aligned with the special sensibilities of women. Now, this dovetails really nicely into some of the political movements that were going on at this time period, in particular, the 19th century progressive movements. And so, that there was, movements in the United States in the end of the 19th century that were basically saying there's a lot of, harm that's going on. When we look at industrialization, look at the horrible working conditions, look at how children are working. When you look at like poverty, like that, all the downsides of people who live in poverty, and that we need to reform, we need to progress to make sure that more people are taken care of. And so that fits in really well with the women's special vote, because women are sensitive to these negative things that are going on in society. And so, you see sort of a joining of the women's voting bloc argument with those men who are involved in the men and women who are involved in the progressive movement. It also dovetails nicely with what the temperance movement in the United States. There was a union called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this was a movement that was dedicated to addressing the harms associated with alcohol, temperance, right? And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union was on the forefront of prohibition, and basically saying, look, when men go out and they get drunk, they bring home a lot of harms to the family and to the society in general. And so we need to reduce, if not eliminate, the presence of alcohol in our society, okay? Again, women bringing this sort of special compassion and understanding to harms, and that we need these sorts of voters in order to improve our society. Good examples of a woman who fought for the right to vote in the women's voting bloc was Jane Addams. She was from Chicago, and I grew up in Chicago, and Jane Addams' Hull House this was a special organization that was dedicated to alleviating the suffering of women and children. And she falls in her, it's part and parcel of this way of bringing women in so that society can be improved. It's also social feminists, right? Not socialist feminists, but social feminists also fall into this the women's voting bloc argument, because they see that women or men are essentially different. And if you don't let women vote, then their essential differences aren't going to be brought to bear on our political system. So given these two arguments, and in light of this time period, which of the two arguments do you think would have been more politically persuasive? The 19th Amendment passes through Congress, and then it goes on to the states to be ratified. And so political arguments need to be made about why states' legislatures should support the 19th Amendment or why they shouldn't support the 19th Amendment. And so do you think that the voting rights as a path for full equality, do you think that would have been more persuasive, basically making the argument that men and women aren't different, they both deserve political rights, and this is a first step to, achieving the American creed of all people being, created equally? Or do you think it would be more persuasive if the argument is made like, hey, don't worry, women aren't going to try to run for office, and we're special and different, and we need to bring our special sensibilities to improve our society and to address some of the harms that are going on in the society? So think about that. There will be a question about that on the midterm exam, so you can sort of think about this prior to taking the exam. So passage of the 19th Amendment is a long and hard fight, including protests and arrests for protesting and hunger strikes that women participated in to draw more and more attention to the crucial business of ratifying and passing the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is first introduced into the Congress in 1870. So just remember that when we amend the Constitution, it must go through the Congress. Both the House and the Senate need to approve, vote in favor of the amendment, and then that amendment goes to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify that amendment. As we know from watching the video on the ERA, amending the Constitution is very difficult. So it's introduced in 1870s. It's the first time that the amendment for the women's vote is introduced, and it fails over and over and over again. In World War I, in the 1914, when the war starts, that begins to bring new attention to women's suffrage, because as we saw, with World War II, men go to fight the war, and then women go to the factories to get jobs in order to make up the loss of the workers that are fighting the war. Similar things happen in World War I, not to as high of an extent as in World War II, but similar. And so the war brings out that, women have this capacity to participate in endeavors that are outside the home. And that brings new attention and new traction to the demand for women's suffrage. But starting in 1914, again, Congress votes and votes and votes and fails to pass the amendment. It finally is passed by both the House and the Senate in June of 1919. And then 36 states were needed to ratify, and the 36th state ratified the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, after a long-fought battle. And here's the language of the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. If you don't include that second section here, you have an amendment that is not enforceable, and you need to have Congress be able to enforce that. Keep in mind, I mentioned it earlier in the lecture that with the passage of the 19th Amendment, it doesn't mean that all women get the right to vote. there are still significant barriers to voting for African Americans in the United States, both men and women. Poll taxes and other barriers make it difficult for many Black women and Black men to vote, and those barriers are not dismantled until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Well, as it is obvious, given that it took until the 1920s to ratify the 19th Amendment, not everybody was on board with the ratification. So you're going to be reading an article this week about those who opposed the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and they are known as the antis. So you'll be reading that book or that article, but I wanted to just show you these postcards that were made at the time period to draw attention to the dangers associated with giving women the right to vote. This postcard here, basically is communicating that, hey, if women get the right to vote, before you know it, they're going to take on men's occupations like being police officers. And if you let women be police officers, they're going to use their rolling pin in order to fight crime ineffectively. Another tact was sort of like that men being emasculated by women who get involved with voting and political activities. And so here's the suffragette Madonna, right? That when women are out there fighting for their rights, then, oh, look, this man is going to have to take care and feed his child. And, oh, isn't he a saint? And also this idea here that, the man is here taking care of his child while his woman's outside the home in an unnatural position fighting for her political rights. So you'll read more about this in the article this week. So what is the impact of the 19th Amendment? Well, there's many impacts. Here are just a few to think about. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, that it upends this conception that politics is a masculine endeavor, an endeavor only for men. As women are given the right to vote and then opportunities to politically participate more fully, that you see that what it means to be a political actor is both feminine, masculine, and everything in between. Women are given more of a direct connection to the political system. It's direct because they can vote. It's no longer indirect and trying to influence their husband or their brother or their father to vote a particular way. Women can go in and directly vote. And that, leads to sparking attention to issues that are associated with suffrage. And so the suffrage movement, as I said, was supported by progressives, those who wanted to reform and address some of the inequalities and some of the harms that were present in our, late 19th century, early 20th century America, and also the concerns regarding alcohol. And so giving women the right to vote, they become more politically active and they draw attention to social reform and temperance. And finally, that America becomes more democratic, right? And here I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean small d democratic. Because as we know, living in a democracy means that you need to have universal suffrage and universal political rights. And expanding the right to women to vote makes the United States more democratic. All right, thanks for listening, and I appreciate your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.